Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zheng Jie. I'm an assistant professor with the School of Computer Engineering at NTU. I'm also affiliated with the Complexity Institute of NTU. My research is on computational systems biology and genomics. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Tom Kirkwood. Professor Kirkwood is the director of the Institute for Aging at Newcastle University and also affiliated with the Copenhagen University Center for Healthy Aging. Professor Kirkwood has made long-standing and pioneering contributions to the science of aging. For example, in 1977, he published his disposable soma theory for aging, which reveals fundamental relations between human longevity and other biological factors such as evolution, reproduction, and so on. In contrast to the programmed aging theory, which says that aging is an inevitable program, Professor Kirkwood's research suggests that aging can be malleable. I believe this can tug at everybody's heartstrings. Professor Kirkwood received his Bachelor of Arts degree in mathematics from the University of Cambridge, Master of Science degree in applied statistics from the University of Oxford, and PhD in biology from the University of Cambridge. He received numerous awards and honors, including the Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2009. I would like to end the introduction by a short personal anecdote. Over a year ago, I did a literature survey with my postdoc fellows on the topic mathematical modeling of aging. Normally, for a hot topic like aging, we can get more authors than expected. So it's a divergent process. However, this literature search turned out to be a convergent process. My postdoc and I quickly narrowed down to just one name, and that is Tom Kirkwood. Let us welcome Professor Kirkwood.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and very warm thanks indeed to Jan and to the Paralimas program here in Singapore. It's a real delight to be at this conference. It's exactly the sort of conference I really like to attend, and so far it has exceeded my expectations, and I'm sure will continue. So I'm going to be talking about aging. I'm going to be talking about silent transformations of aging. And let's see, will this work? No, maybe not. And there are actually two areas in which we need to consider aging from the perspective of silent transformations. This is the silent transformation of the body as the aging process plays out across the life course, and the silent transformation of society as changes occur, as we're all aware, around the world, resulting in people living longer and longer and longer. So what I did in preparation for this talk was just go to the World Bank data resources and show the increase in life expectancy recorded in a selected number of countries here over the last 7 years. At the top is Japan, which has been consistently the longest living country for the last 20 or so years. Next below that is Singapore, which is doing extremely well in the longevity stakes. Next below that is the UK. Obviously, I've selected relevant countries here. Denmark below that, a country in which I've recently taken up an appointment. We can see the United States, which does not do so brilliantly well in the longevity stakes. And then we can see the red line at the bottom is longevity for the whole world. There's a remarkably consistent pattern when we look at this. And we can see that over the course of the last 7 years, life expectancy in the world and in these selected countries has increased by 2 to 2.5, sometimes 3 years. This is a silent transformation of enormous impact for our world. And although it's silent, I just want to transform what is happening into a brief moment of rather quiet noise. But just listen to this. And I could carry on. What is happening is that every time I clap my hands, life expectancy for every man, woman, and child on planet Earth is increasing by 1 second. So this is an ongoing, a continuing change, which is quiet. We don't really notice it. We're beginning to become aware of some of the societal consequences of that. That's not a hypothesis. That is fact. That is what the statistics here from an authority such as the World Bank tell us is happening. And of course, we can look at countries and look at the change in the age makeup of the population. And we can do this for pretty much any country in the world. I chose for this example Finland, because there's a particularly clear transformation over the course of less than 1 century from a traditional pyramid-shaped population structure with a great preponderance of young people in the population to the more cylindrical population structure that we see more recently. And the same sort of pattern would apply if I showed you population structure for Singapore, if I showed you population structure for the UK. We might get the impression that this silent transformation of the world in terms of life expectancy is a luxury only of the rich countries, but that would be mistaken. But what I'm showing you here is a photograph that I took some 25 years ago when I was on a trip in West Africa, and I was crossing the border between Burkina Faso into the north of Ghana in one of the poorest regions of the world, where child mortality is still 25% before age 5. So an enormous number of children are dying before they reach age 5. And when I looked at the wall behind the immigration officer, I could see on the right the kind of poster you would expect to see here. This is a poster describing how to make oral rehydration solution to prevent death from diarrhea in small children. No surprise, in this region, diarrhea causes a tremendous number of deaths. But the poster on the left was a real surprise, because this is a part of the world where your chances of living to a great old age would seemingly be quite small, and it's a part of the world where traditional respect for older people is very, very strong. So if the Ghanaian Ministry of Health thought it worthwhile to print posters telling people young today, old tomorrow, help care for the aged, it's a sign of the extent of the change that's occurring. So if we look at the sort of global picture, and this is a rather lovely paper that was published by 2 of the world's leading historical demographers in Science a few years ago, it shows the quite astonishing increase in life expectancy that has occurred around the world over the course of the last 2 centuries. For some reason, life expectancy is known not to have increased much prior to 1800, and from 1800 it increased at an amazingly linear rate. No one understands why it is so linear. It's a simple fact of the demography. It'd be lovely if we could identify an underlying hypothesis, a theory that could explain why it should increase so linearly. The way the graph was plotted, each data point shows what was, for the year in question, the life expectancy in what in that year was the longest living country in the world. So the leaders have changed identity over the course of 200 years. As I said, consistently, Japan has been the longest living country recently. So that's the background increase in life expectancy, and it makes it all the more astonishing. If you look at the top right corner, back in 1980, the United Nations Demographic Forecasting Unit get the best brains together. If they look in the rearview mirror, they see that life expectancy is increasing steadily at a rate of 2 to 2.5 years per decade. And what do they predict? They predict something that seems quite surprising, and that is that almost next year, the increase in life expectancy is going to drop practically to 0. Now you can see that, as often happens with what the United Nations says we should do, humanity completely ignored the instruction from the United Nations, and life expectancy carried on increasing at exactly the same rate as before. So the UN tried again in 1990 to make predictions, and you can see they got it wrong again in 1990. And then in 2000, they made predictions that correspond pretty much to what we think is properly happening now. But the important point about this is that there's great uncertainty about what the future may hold. And it's rather interesting to ask, why did the United Nations, together with every other national forecasting agency, get things so badly wrong in 1980? And in order to understand that, you need to ask, what did people think they knew about the aging process at that time? Well, most people hadn't really thought about aging as a problem in science. It was just implicitly assumed that the body was programmed to age and die at a certain point. And at that point, if you looked at the historical record, the increase in life expectancy to that point had been driven by only one thing, and that is that we were becoming better and better and better at preventing deaths in the early and middle years of life. And we did that through obvious things, by sanitation, sewers, clean drinking water, then vaccines against the big killing diseases, and then in the middle of the 20th century through the development of antibiotics. So by the time we got through to the 1970s, we had reduced deaths in the early and middle years of life in the high-income countries of the world to such a low level that if you could wave a magic wand and eradicate all death before the age 50, you would see a further increase in life expectancy of only between 1 and 2 months. So, the expectation was we would just simply all live long enough to grow old and die, and that would be pretty much the end of the story. But what no one had seen coming, and what has transformed our understanding of this process, is that from the 1970s onwards, a completely new driver of increasing life expectancy became apparent, and now this is the only thing that is driving the increase in life expectancy in all the countries that I showed earlier. And that is that people are now reaching old age in better and better and better condition, and what is driving the increase are the reducing death rates of people who are old already. So death rates in the UK for people aged 80 and above are now well below half what they were 50 years ago, and there is no sign that this trend is going to slow and stop. So this is the silent transformation of society, if you like, and it's probably the biggest game changer on the planet. And I would argue that it probably exceeds even climate change in the implications that it's going to have for the way we organize and plan and live our lives. And that's not to in any way belittle the significance of what is occurring with our climate. But this is so profound that it is altering every aspect of human society. But it does mean that we have to really pay attention to the nature of the silent transformation of the body, to try to understand what is this process called aging, what is happening to the aging process, and where might it go in the future. So during the main part of my talk, these are the questions that I want to touch on. I want to ask, what do we understand about why and how the body ages? What is the relationship between aging as a process and disease? Because we know that with more people living longer, there is a greater prevalence of a whole spectrum of age-associated diseases. What is it that explains this continuing increase in life expectancy? Can we understand what's driving it? If we did, we would maybe be able to better predict what the future would hold and may be able to adapt the changes to suit our preferred outcomes. And then a really important question is what accounts for the individuality of the aging process? Because aging is a process that affects us all, but we know it affects us in different ways. And it would be nice if we could use science to understand the factors that explain those differences. And at the end, if I leave myself time, I want to make a few remarks on what is necessary to, as it were, change the mindset as we look towards the challenges of the silent transformation of the body and the transformation of society. So, as was said in the introduction, and as I said a moment ago, the default assumption about aging is that the body is programmed to age and die. This was the first idea that was proposed back in the late 19th century, and I find for people who come new to the question, 9 times out of 10, this is what people propose. They say aging is obviously a biological necessity because it's the way that species get rid of the old individuals who would otherwise overcrowd the environment, take living space that's needed for the next generation. And people sometimes say, well, of course you need aging to secure the turnover of generations so that each generation dies and makes way for the generation in which new mutations may be throwing up the potential for adaptation that will allow the species to sort of keep abreast in the continual race to evolve to be fitter and fitter and better. There are fundamental reasons why we now know that this idea that aging is programmed is about as wrong as a scientific theory could be. The first reason is that if we look at the natural world, it's extremely rare that we see old animals. If aging had evolved as a mechanism to rid the world of animals that were past their sell-by date, as it were, you would expect to see that process actually doing something. So you would see animals becoming old and dying because they were becoming old. And although we do see, for population studied in the wild, there is some evidence that a small number of survivors live long enough to exhibit signs of senescence, the numbers are statistically so small that it cannot be the basis for the evolution of a program for aging. There just isn't enough of it happening for natural selection to have acted upon this. The second, that means basically that there's neither a need nor an opportunity for aging to evolve. And then the last point is that the whole sort of understanding of the way that natural selection works tells us that even if the previous problems were set aside and we imagined that a program for aging had evolved, then this program would be unstable, because if genes drive the aging process and those genes were to become mutated, natural selection would tend to favor the spread of the broken mutations through the population, and immortality, freedom from senescence, would spread through the population. So, I mean, obviously, these arguments are more complex than I've been able to summarize now, and there's a reference here to a paper published fairly recently that spells out these arguments in greater detail, because they are really important to our understanding of why it is that aging actually comes about. And I want to lead you through an understanding of what we now believe to be the primary reasons why aging occurs. And in order to do this, I want to really sort of take us through the silent transformation of the body from the beginning. So this is the beginning of life. If you don't recognize the image you're looking at, it's a beautiful image of a human egg at the moment of fertilization. Just to the right of the ovum here, you can see the sperm that's about to achieve union with the egg. And this is just a point to remind you of the old joke that life is a sexually transmitted condition with an invariably fatal outcome. So this is a process that begins with cells that are pretty perfect, because the quality control that leads to the egg and leads to the sperm is strong. And that means that the cells that you see here are in really tip-top condition. But, and for this we're indebted to the great German naturalist who did most of his work in the 19th century, died in 1914, August Weismann. To my mind, you know, up there, second really maybe only to Darwin in the significance of the contributions he made to our understanding of evolutionary biology. And Weismann left us with one really important concept, among the others that he described. But the one that I want to pick on now is the distinction that he drew between, within our multicellular bodies, the lineage of what Weismann called the germline. Those are the reproductive cells shown in this cartoon as the eggs, and the rest of the body, Weismann termed the soma, shown here by the chickens. And what Weismann recognized with great clarity is that we have this interesting contrast between the immortality of the lineage of the germline and the mortality of soma. And just to make this real for you, let me just get you to think about your body. You know, you walked into this auditorium a few minutes ago. You brought into the room your body containing about 100 million cells. Now just think about this. Where do those cells come from? Well, we know that they come from the fertilized egg that began your life, and we know that the sperm and the egg came from the bodies of your parents, and we can go back a generation, and we can go back a generation. So you are sitting there, 100 million cells. Every single one of your cells that's here in the room today could, if the records existed, could trace its presence here through an unbroken chain of cell division that goes back 4 billion years to the emergence of the earliest cellular life on this planet. You wouldn't be here if that didn't happen. So in a sense, you are touched with immortality. You know, your cells have this astonishing legacy. And if you have kids, the cells that you contribute to their bodies will carry that lineage forward into the future. But it won't apply to you. You will die. Sorry if that's news to you. I hope it isn't news to anyone in the room today. But it is really important because it raises a fundamental issue, the paradox of understanding the immortality of the germline versus the disposability of the soma. And through this, I believe, lies the key to understanding the silent transformation of the aging body. I want to, sort of just before getting to the punchline on this, to take you back. This was, I started publishing my first scientific papers a long time ago in 1975. And this was from one of the first papers I published. And at that time, I was interacting with great figures like Leslie Orgel and Sidney Brenner and people. And there was interest at the time in the stability of the macromolecular machinery of the cells. And what I developed was a model that allowed you to compute from one generation of cells, generation T, what would be the molecular integrity at the next cellular generation T plus 1. And on a very general set of assumptions, the relationship looked to be, here's the sort of the plane, this is where things are getting better, this is the line of equality between T and T plus 1, this is where things are getting worse. And under very, very general assumptions, the model predicted that you would have this kind of S-shaped curve. And this intersects the line of equality in 2 points. The upper point here is a point of quasi-stability, because if you fall below that, you will be restored to that point. The lower point is the point of disastrous entry into a collapse towards what was termed error catastrophe. So this is what the model showed. But we could take it further. And in the model, I was able to demonstrate that the margin of safety that exists between those 2 points of equal stability, molecular integrity, would be increased or decreased according to how much the cell was prepared to invest in the accuracy of proofreading, the synthesis of macromolecules, and in the clearance mechanisms to get rid of erroneous or damaged molecules. So this provides a degree of freedom on which selection can operate. And it became apparent that you could save a large amount of energy if you were prepared to accept a situation in which the cells lived their life on a knife edge, where they were quite close to precipitating themselves towards the path of error catastrophe. Now, you wouldn't want to do that if you're talking about germline, because the integrity of the lineage is so important for the continuation of the species. But as we'll see in a moment, it's a slightly different story for the somatic cells. And then the other thing that I want to introduce here is the understanding that has come over the last 3 decades or so in terms of what's now called physiological ecology. And this is the idea that organisms, under the pressure of natural selection, have to find the optimum way to use the resources that they can acquire from their environment and transform these during the course of their lifetime into an output of progeny. And if I lift the lid off the black box, you can see that organisms face an allocation issue. Just like you do with the money in your personal bank account, you cannot spend it twice. So the organism cannot spend the same resource on growing, on reproducing, on maintenance of its body, on storage. It faces tough choices. So the all-important question that I want to ask is, given everything that I've said up until now, how much should our genomes evolve to invest in the maintenance and repair of the somatic cells, tissues, and organs of our bodies? Now, in nature, animals die young. Wild mice, it's been studied very carefully. We see that more than 90% of wild mice are dead before their first birthday. It's extremely rare for a mouse in the wild to live 18 months, 15 months. So what that means is that as far as mice in nature are concerned, how good a body do they need? Well, all they need is a body that will remain in decent shape for 18 months. And that's what mice have. They have a body that does not show significant deterioration before that time. But that's all they need, because it's extremely rare statistically for a mouse to survive beyond that period. So natural selection will optimize the investment in maintenance to be not too little, because then the animal will fall apart too quickly, but not too much, because that's expensive. And the upshot is that you evolve to set your mechanisms for maintenance and repair to keep the body in good shape through the period of time that you have a reasonable expectation still to be alive in the wild environment, but not more than that. I'm showing this in a sort of cartoon style, but sort of this is backed up by mathematics of sort of optimality modeling and so on. And you can go to the papers if you want to read the detail. But the idea is fundamental. It's basically, the idea was called the disposable soma theory because it's akin to the strategy of a manufacturer who's deciding how much to invest in the durability of his product. If you make it too shoddy, it will fall apart and the customer will be dissatisfied and they will buy someone else's product. If you make it too robust, it will be too expensive and they will go somewhere else and they will buy someone else's product who's got the balance right. And I would argue that that is what nature has given us, something that gets the balance right for the ecological circumstances, the wild circumstances in which most organisms live their lives. And this has quite a number of predictions about the nature of the aging process. That maintenance and repair should be high in germline, but reduced in soma, that aging is caused primarily by damage, that how long an organism lives is going to be regulated by the investments it makes in maintenance and repair. And then from the perspective of complexity, a whole set of other predictions arise that are fascinating and have been a sort of rich source of study. So it's inherently stochastic. Although there's a reproducibility about the aging process, from individual to individual, there is significant scope for the play of chance. There's a multiplicity of mechanisms, it's inherently complex, and also something I don't have time to go into now, there's a lot of evidence for the evolution of plasticity and of trade-offs in the way that the body may undergo the aging process. And we see this, for example, emerging as a way to explain the phenomenon that some animals, if you reduce the food available, so you're mimicking a period of famine in the wild, they adjust the balance that they make between maintenance and reproduction in order to be able to keep the organism in good shape for a bit longer so that hopefully they survive in order to be able to reproduce at a better time in the future when food supplies have been restored. So this kind of plasticity emerges quite naturally out of the logic of the theory. Back in the original paper on the disposable soma theory, I wrote towards the end of the paper, I wrote these words, that accuracy in the germline is vital, but a luxury in somatic cells, and that aging may therefore be the result of a switching off of the mechanisms responsible for high accuracy at around the time of the differentiation of somatic cells from the germline. Now, it doesn't often happen in a scientific career that you get the opportunity that someone publishes a result and you can say, I told you so. But a few years ago, someone, Gabriel Saretsky, did some lovely studies using mouse embryonic stem cells in the first study and then human embryonic stem cells in the second study, and induced the cells to differentiate. And embryonic stem cells are effectively germline cells, and they can proliferate indefinitely. But within a couple of days of these cells being induced to undergo differentiation and become cells of what are called embryoid bodies, what was seen was that there was a comprehensive downregulation of the antioxidant defenses, the DNA repair enzymes, the chaperones that clear up messes in protein. And if you look at markers of cellular damage, this is embryonic stem cells, day 0 of the embryoid bodies, day 2, day 4, is that from about day 2 onwards, you see a steep increase in the amount of damage. So, this is tantalizing because it suggests that there may be this early switching in the commitment of resource to maintenance of the cells. In terms of biology, we've heard discussion of important players like Sidney Brenner and those who contributed to the elucidation of what is known as the central dogma of molecular biology, which is that living systems are sustained by the replication of DNA, its transcription and translation into protein. And we learn this as if it was a kind of lock and key, like playing with Lego. You have Watson-Crick base pairing, you have the synthesis of proteins according to the codon-anticodon matching of the genetic code. But it isn't like that at all, because what we're learning is that every single step of macromolecular synthesis is being attacked all the time by agents of disruption and damage. This is a silent transformation, but if you could hear this stuff that is going on in our bodies in the room this afternoon, imagine that we could hear the attack that comes from reactive oxygen species, free radicals. Every single one of the cells in your body today is going to have its DNA zapped on the average 10,000 times in the next 24 hours by these kinds of agents and disruption. It would be a cacophony of noise. And if you could hear the armies of repair enzymes that are working to put that damage right, so we have antioxidant defenses, we have repair enzymes, we have things that aid the clearance, we have the proteins that facilitate these reactions. It's a very dynamic interplay between the forces of destruction and the forces of maintenance. And then we have the mitochondria, the generators of the energy on which everything else depends, which happen at the same time also to be the source of some of the major agents of destruction. So this is an incredibly complex and networked process within living systems. And we need to understand how these processes are degraded by the passage of aging. It's also something where the field is experimentally challenging, because we live in an era where biology has become more and more reductionist, and quite rightly so, because in order to be able to understand the details of particular enzyme reactions and so on, we need to be able to probe down to the smaller and smaller detail of the system. The trouble is, as you do that, as you become more and more detailed about one particular component of this large networked scheme, you lose sight of the whole picture. So what you have in the field of aging, and it's a rather sad sort of statement, is that you have, it's like a children's playground. You have a lot of little gangs who are running around. So you have the gang that thinks that aging is all caused by mitochondrial DNA mutations, and you have the gang that says it's all due to somatic mutations in the chromosomes, and a gang that says it's all due to the aggregation of proteins, denaturation of proteins. But the answer is, it isn't this mechanism or that mechanism or the other mechanism. It has to be this mechanism and that mechanism and the other mechanism. And what we have to do is to approach this recognizing the complexity and building models that allow us to take account, in particular, of the interactions that arise. One of the things that contributes to sort of the unfolding of aging is just simply somatic mutation. We go from the first cell, the fertilized egg, to the adult body through a process of cell division. Now, at cell division, DNA has to replicate, and we know that DNA replication is one of the most exquisitely faithful processes on the planet. The DNA replication machinery makes one mistake for every 10 to the 9 nucleotides that are copied. It does that because it invests massively in error correction and proofreading. That is unbelievably accurate. But remember this, the typical human cell contains 6 times 10 to the 9 nucleotides that need to be copied. And what that means is that every time a cell divides in your body, the likelihood is that it will introduce a handful of new mutations. So, we're all told these days we live and work in the era of the personalized genome, and so we do. But equally, I can tell you that you do not have 2 cells in your body today that have the same DNA sequence as each other. And you won't have a single cell in your body today that has the same DNA sequence as was present in the fertilized egg that began your life. So your DNA is becoming scrambled all the time. The mutation is inescapable. And we can visualize that. You can actually look, this is a fairly simple experiment, just looking at mutations across the life course at a particular gene locus. This is in mice. The wild-type mice show an increase, as you can see by the open symbols. The SAM, senescence accelerated mice, is a mouse model developed in Kyoto that ages much faster than the normal and accumulates mutations at a greater rate. So we can actually begin to get to grips with this. With the power of confocal microscopy these days, we can actually look at cells, we can visualize the molecular damage that we associate with aging. And I won't go into the detail of this because this is not a molecular biology presentation, but we can see in the dark oval that's in the middle, the nucleus, we can see individual DNA lesions, some of them at the telomeres, the protective tips at the ends of the chromosomes, and some of them elsewhere on the chromosomes. And in the mess of the cell around the cytoplasm, the fluorescent staining here is highlighting mitochondria, the all-important energy-forming organelles, according to whether they are damaged or intact. And all you need to know to make sense of this picture is to know that green is bad and red is good. So as you get older, if you find it a little bit harder to hurry for the bus, or maybe you find it a little bit harder to retrieve that piece of information from your memory banks, it may be because your cells are just not producing the same levels of ATP that they were producing when you were younger. So this is going on at the most fundamental level within the body. But then there's another level, which is also really important in terms of this silent transformation. And this is that our cells have lived with damage throughout their entire evolutionary history. And in a multicellular body, you've got to keep the community of cells in pretty good shape in order to be able to keep going. So what do you do when a cell becomes damaged? One response that we've known about for a few decades now is that you tell the cell to kill itself. It has an internal self-monitoring system, and if the threshold is passed, the cell undergoes what's called apoptosis, or programmed cell death. Now, programmed cell death is very important in biology. It's a sculpting tool. It's how the embryo takes shape. It's very important in the immune system, because the immune system is generating novelty by high level of mutation all the time to be able to deal with new pathogens. But that produces autoreactive cells that would give you autoimmune disease if you couldn't kill them through apoptosis. But as cells become damaged in other ways, they become a risk of malignancy. So we also have apoptosis as a mechanism for getting rid of cells that are damaged. And what we see is that in pretty well every organ of the body, the frequency of apoptosis increases as we get older, because age is associated with damage. In the old days, when people thought that aging was programmed, everybody thought, aha, apoptosis is the aging program, because you see a lot of programmed cell death occurring in aging organs and tissues. It's not programmed aging. It's a survival mechanism, and you see more of it in aged tissues because damage is accumulating in aged tissues. And over the last 15 years, we've seen some lovely experimental studies where you can make transgenic animal models in which you can make the animals more prone to undergo apoptosis in response to a small amount of damage. Now, these models were generated because people were interested in studying them from the perspective of protection against cancer. Make the cells more likely to kill themselves if they experience a bit of damage, and the hypothesis was they would be better protected against cancer. And they are. What people hadn't expected, what's really interesting, is that those cells, those animals that are better protected against cancer, age faster, because they're killing cells that they should have kept. And they're accelerating their aging because they're accelerating the age-related loss of tissue cellularity. So it raises the important point that maybe you don't need to actually kill all the cells that are damaged if they're not in a particularly critical part of the body. And this brings us to a phenomenon that was first described in the early 1960s of what is called cell replicative senescence. And when this was described by Len Hayflick, what he observed was that cells divide and divide and divide, and then they stop dividing. And it was commonly thought at that point they died, and it was thought that this was kind of the aging process seen at the cellular level. Well, we know now that they stop dividing for sure, but they don't die. If you keep topping up, refreshing the medium, you can keep those cells. They've stopped dividing. They will never divide again, but you can keep them alive for years in culture. So something else must be going on. And this was a problem that I started studying over the last 10 years, and started studying, first of all, from a theoretical standpoint, going back to a remarkable paper published in Science back in 1980, where Smith and Whitney had shown that if you took population of cells derived from a single clonal founder, they demonstrated tremendous stochastic heterogeneity in the division potential of the individual cells. So whatever was going on in replicative senescence, it was not under control. It was not a program. It was something that was much more amenable to the action of chance. And what a few years ago with a mathematical modeler, Pete Sozu, we did was to build a fairly simple model, but populated with data from as much biochemistry as we could get, which looked at the interactions of multiple mechanisms that we thought might be contributing to the aging process at the cellular level. And we were able, with reasonable degree of accuracy, to replicate the heterogeneity that had been observed in the experiments. And this then led me to hypothesize that maybe what we needed to do experimentally was to look and see whether we could detect that the processes that seemed to be important in generating the heterogeneity in the models, which were particularly the production of cells that carried heavy burdens of mitochondrial mutation, perhaps we could actually find this if we designed the experiments to look in that particular way. And João Passos, who did a PhD with me from Portugal, did a remarkable experiment, and we published a paper a few years later in PLOS Biology, where the title confirms exactly what the model had predicted, which is that the mitochondrial variability, the stochastic mitochondrial variability, explained the heterogeneity that we saw in senescence that was driven by the progressive erosion of telomeres, because there's interaction between these different kinds of processes. And this is an area where, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to skip through this fairly rapidly, but we then built on that to use all the power of modern bioinformatics analysis to do kind of in silico analysis of the interactions between the molecular players within the cells. We did stochastic modeling to sort of determine what might be working. And on the basis of this, in a paper published 6 years ago now, we found that it appears within cells that there is a dynamic feedback loop that integrates the contribution to the damage burden in the cell that comes from multiple different compartments. And schematically, what we found was that it's like this, that this shows the nucleus of the cell. This represents damage at telomeres. This represents mutations in the chromosomes. And this is damage in the mitochondria. And it's a little bit like an aircraft that has left the terminal and is taxiing towards the runway. And the pilots are running through all of their cockpit checks to make sure that the systems are ready to support safe takeoff. And what the cell does is it integrates through this feedback loop, checks on the status of the cell. And if any red lights come on, it doesn't matter where the red light comes on, but if the red lights come on, they say, hey, wait a minute. And then we were able to show that the cell is given about 5 days, 5 to 7 days, to get its act together. And if it doesn't manage to turn those red lights to green within that period, everything says, right, lock down. Do not divide again. The cell becomes permanently arrested in cell division. And this contributes to the aging process. And what we're seeing now, very nice work by colleagues at the Mayo Clinic, are showing that these senescent cells that are locked in this state contribute to the development of age-related conditions. In another piece of work showing what it is that determines longevity, a PhD student with me, Pankaj Kapahi, showed that if you compare species having different lifespans, different mammalian species, and you measure the capacity of cells grown from these different mammalian species to withstand the bad stuff that life throws at the cells, and each panel shows a different kind of bad stuff, what you see is a clear positive association between capacity to withstand damage and stress and the longevity of the species from which the cells were grown. So the picture is kind of coming together, that yeah, aging is driven by damage. It is to some extent regulated, and one of the important things is the commitment that is made to maintenance and repair. So I've taken much longer over the first of these points. You'll be relieved to know I'll go through the other ones much more quickly now. But it provides us with the basis for understanding the underpinning mechanisms of the silent transformation of the body, and really relates this to the complexity and to the disruption of systems, something we tend to take biological systems for granted because they work so well. We tend not to look at the things that go wrong, and it's the things that go wrong that contribute to aging. So what's the relationship between aging and disease? Well, we're now beginning to see early stages of a shift of emphasis. This is a diagram from the National Institute on Aging, simply showing that aging is at the core of most of the medical conditions that are important in today's medical world. So I won't bother to read them all out. You can read much faster than I can speak. But we know that aging is important for all of these. We know that in the context of all of these different conditions, there's a huge medical research industry. And I've taken some examples here: Alzheimer's disease, strongly age-related; heart disease, strongly age-related; cancer, strongly age-related. Most of the research that's published on these conditions is looking for risk factors. And the risk factors that tend to be the focus of attention are things like diabetes, physical inactivity, ApoE genotype, smoking, hypertension, smoking, cholesterol, diabetes for heart disease, and so on. And this generates a lot of excitement within these individual disease contexts. Curiously, what people fail to do is to look at aging as a risk factor. And what I've done in the bottom panels here is to put in aging, and I've not taken anything away. I've left all the others. This one, hypertension, smoking, cholesterol, diabetes. But this is how it's dwarfed by aging, and the same for the other things. And yet, in the global biomedical research industry, almost no attention is paid to what comes to the pathogenic process for these conditions from intrinsic aging. And I believe that the big transformation that has to come to medical science as we go further into the 21st century is to recognize that when we look at age-related diseases, we focus on the end-stage pathology. So we focus on the plaques and tangles in an Alzheimer brain. We focus on the loss of trabecular bone connections with osteoporosis and whatever. And what we need to be doing is to be working upstream to the initiating processes, where if we can identify them, interventions are much more likely to be effective. We're beginning to make early steps, and what's exciting is that as we work upstream from one particular age-related disease, we find that we're entering the same common areas that are characteristic of other conditions. And what are these upstream areas? They're intrinsic aging. This is really what we need to attend to. So this is sort of one of the messages that comes through really strongly from this. And when we look at what's going on in the diseases, we find exactly the same processes that I've shown you we tend to associate with intrinsic aging. So what is it with this understanding that explains the continuing increase in life expectancy? And actually, it turns out to be pretty simple. Intrinsic aging is driven by random molecular damage. This is, I think, sort of conclusively demonstrated, leads to an accumulation of cellular defects, leads over the course of a lifetime to frailty, disability, disease. But this is not happening in a body that is separate from the circumstances in which we live our lives. And what we're learning now is that things like nutrition, we can have bad nutrition, too much sugar, too much saturated fat. It doesn't make us just a bit fat and a bit unhealthy. It actually drives the accumulation of molecular defects that are at the heart of the aging process. And healthy nutrition makes us healthier and slows the aging process because it enhances the body's capacity for maintenance and repair. And the same is true of things like stress, which accelerates damage, adverse environments. The benefits of good lifestyle come because if you exercise, you actually stress and damage the cells, but you upregulate your body's maintenance and repair system, so you end up in better shape than you would have done if you hadn't gone out and got all hot and sweaty on the treadmill or the running track or wherever it is. So I'm going to go quickly through just a few observations on what it is that accounts for the individuality of aging, because this is important to us as individuals. The sad fact, as I mentioned earlier, is that each one of us in the room knows we're going to die one day, but actually we don't know when it's going to happen, and we mostly don't know what we're going to die from. And it would be quite nice in populations if we could begin to investigate this a bit better. So there are things like genes, things like nutrition, things like lifestyle, and so on that we can investigate. Genetics, it's long believed that the best recipe for a long life is to choose your parents carefully. And the evidence from genetic studies, chiefly out of Scandinavia, is that that's true. You compare the ages at death of monozygotic twins, and statistically they're more similar than for dizygotic twins. And by comparing the difference in variance, you can actually estimate the magnitude of the genetic contribution, and it turns out to be about 25%. So 1/4 of what will influence the length of your life is down to your parents, the genetics, but 3/4 is non-genetic. So bear that in mind. If you come from a long-lived family, don't be too complacent about it. You've got 3/4 you can screw up. And if you don't come from a long-lived family, don't be too depressed about it. You've got 3/4 you can work with. A lot of people have spent quite a lot of money over the last 10, 12 years trying to identify the genes that are involved. And I've been involved in the biggest of those programs in Europe. And I have to say it's been slightly disappointing, because after all that time, all that collection of samples, all the genome-wide analyses and everything, we've found almost nothing. And the reason is, perhaps as theory might predict, there are so many genes that contribute to the genetic contribution, and they all have such tiny effects that they don't show up as statistically significant unless you've got absolutely huge studies. But where we do get a sniff of what they're They're about maintenance and repair. Nutrition. There are big population-based studies that have looked at nutritional factors in lifespan. Big one in Europe here looked at classifying people according to how Mediterranean-like their diet was. Because it was a European study, we looked to the Mediterranean regions for healthy eating. If we were doing it in Asia, we would be looking to Singapore, to Japan, the longest living country in the world, where there are similarities between healthy diets in the Asian cuisine and healthy diets in the Mediterranean cuisine. And what we see is that if you go on a 10-point scale, 2 units to the more Mediterranean, the healthier end of the process, you reduce overall mortality by 8%. Pretty good. This is an example that I've chosen from close to home in Newcastle. We have a metro system. If you get on the metro at the posh end of the line, which is out Pontyland South, and you ride on the metro for about 25 minutes and you come down to a station called Baika, during the course of that process, you've lost 11 years of healthy life expectancy. Now, the metro is not great. It's not like the MRT and maybe in Singapore, but it's not that bad. It's not riding on the metro that does it. It's the socioeconomic differences between the regions that you're passing through. I think one of the hugest challenges in today's world is, what is it about socioeconomic circumstances that produces these dramatic effects on life expectancy and health expectancy? In Newcastle since 2006, we've been running a study. When we started it, there was almost nothing known about the global picture of the health of people at advanced old age. So we started the study in order to be able to investigate this. And our design was very simple. We got funding, we got ethical approval to approach everyone registered with the National Health Service in Newcastle who had been born in 1921. We began this in the year of their 85th birthday. And with the agreement of the participants, we measured almost everything that we could measure about them. It was a huge undertaking, massive commitment of time by the participants. We had a fabulous team of research nurses. We got blood samples. We had a stipulation that the blood had to get from the vein of the participant back into our labs in the university in a maximum of 1 hour, and we were able to achieve that in every case. So we got really fresh blood back. We measured 74 different analytes in the blood. I'm not going to try and show you anything of the complete set of data. A lot of it has been published, but we've still got publishing about 20 papers a year coming out of the mountain of data that we've accumulated on this. I'll just show you a couple that make an interesting point in relationship to the transformation of society. We were able for each individual in the study to determine through the nurse assessments and through the examination of their doctor's records whether they had or did not have any of 18 different age-related diseases. And the histogram here shows the disease count. And what we found was that rather sadly, nobody in our sample of more than 1,000 people had nothing wrong with them at age 85. And actually 3/4 of the population had 4 or more age-related illnesses. But rather surprisingly, we found when we asked them to self-rate their health, in spite of having all these things wrong with them, 78%, that's nearly 4 out of every 5, self-rated their health and quality of life as being good, very good, or excellent, which is very positive because it tells us that in spite of the health challenges of an old population, people can still live a pretty good life. And we were also able, in a similar way, to measure each of 17 different essential activities of daily living. And there's great variation in the population according to who could do things and who could not do things. But quite encouragingly, we found that a sizable proportion of the population at age 85 had no functional limitation at all. They could do everything. So this was the first time that data like this had been published. Now we've got replica studies going in Japan, in New Zealand, in the Netherlands, and building up. It would be great to do a study like this in Singapore, which is a sort of city-state of the right geographical dimensions to be able to do something like that. So finally, and I apologize, I've gone a little longer than the 3/4 of an hour, but I'll try to finish in 2 or 3 minutes now. Changing the mindset. People are living longer and longer all the time. This is a headline from an English newspaper. It's about 10 years ago. And this captures the negativity that exists around the world about the increase in life expectancy. It's humanity's greatest success story, arguably, and yet we still are pretty confused about it. Now, to be fair, this came from the financial pages, and it was referring to the problems of pension schemes, which are a real challenge. But it is a bit of a problem, and people psychologically have to adjust to what is changing in society. We see, we've heard quite a lot about computing developments. It's very interesting if we look at what is happening around Silicon Valley to see how, Larry Ellison from Oracle is investing a lot of money in research. He has this extraordinary statement here. Death has never made any sense to me. How can a person be there and then just vanish, just not be there? Well, I don't know where Larry Ellison has lived his life to this stage, but it's quite an interesting sort of philosophical issue. And Larry Page, this new company started by Google a few years ago, Calico, is committed to stopping, even reversing aging. But I like the quote from Bill Gates at the bottom here, which is, reintroduces a touch of humility. It says that when the world is full of so many problems, maybe we shouldn't be spending so much effort on trying to make people live forever. But there are important issues that relate to adjusting our society to a world where we're all living longer. One of these was something that I got involved with for the Government Office for Science in the UK about 8 years ago. And this was looking at the trajectory of what we call mental capital and well-being through life. And you could, if you like, see this as another silent transformation. It's how we go from a child with no kind of mental capital accumulated through education, through development, through learning. Mental capital doesn't just mean skills, it also means the emotional resilience, the capacity to set goals for the future, to deal with adverse events. It's a really important conceptualization of an issue. And we follow a trajectory through life. And what we want to do is to optimize that kind of trajectory. And this project, because it came from the Government Office for Science, was a science-based project which was quite well resourced. And we were able to commission state-of-the-art reviews from 40 or 50 scientists around the world on factors that would impact on the trajectory of mental capital across life. And a summary paper was published in Nature back in 2008. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to attempt to say much more about this. Perhaps the only thing I'd pick up on is that one of the most important issues in today's world is the waste of mental capital that is occurring through the marginalization of older people. And as someone who has reached the age of 65 and in the UK system is now being sort of shuffled off down the pathway of retirement, it's partly the reason why I've taken this new job at the University of Copenhagen, because it gives me an opportunity to keep my mental capital active and deployed. So key questions, and this is really sort of drawing things to a close, I've listed here. Can we identify the precise factors? So I've given you a quick gallop through the science that is associated with these silent transformations, but we need to get to the details. So we need to improve our knowledge in each of these different areas. And I think that's all I'll say, because I'm sure you've scanned them while I've been speaking. I'm just going to close by picking up on some of the common misconceptions. I hope I've sort of dispelled the misconception that aging is programmed. There is a perception that old age is inevitably a period of poor quality existence, and I hope the data that I've shown you from the Newcastle 85+ study helps you to see that in a somewhat different light. The other ones here are not ones that I've touched on yet, but I'm going to very, very briefly touch on them because I think it's important that we appreciate that these are misconceptions. The first is that population aging is the main cause of increased health costs. Who believes that? Put up your hands if you believe that population... I've told you it's a misconception, so you've got to be brave to put up your hand. But most people believe that population aging is the major driver of increased health costs and care costs. It isn't. What is driving health costs is just that medicine is becoming more technological all the time. Where health costs are incurred, for all of us as we live our life course, 90% of the health costs we will incur arise during the last 6 months of our life. Dying is what is expensive. Living longer is not intrinsically expensive. Now, who's dying these days? It's old people. So if you simply categorize healthcare expenditure by age categories in the population, you'll find that 80 to 85-year-olds are having more spent on them than 75 to 80-year-olds and so on. But if you take account of the fact that that expenditure is to do with dying. The increase is entirely driven by the advances in medical technology. Population aging is the major cause of growth in the size of the world's population. This, again, is completely untrue, because all the long-living countries in the world have reduced their birth rates so that they are below replacement. Singapore is a very good example. Japan, pretty well every European country. Life expectancy is high. Fertility rates are so low that the populations are shrinking. Population is growing because we become better at stopping kids from dying. And the communities in which that has occurred have not yet woken up to the fact that you therefore need to make a corresponding adjustment in the number of kids that you choose to have. So this will work through in a generation or two. The world is overpopulated and it will get worse, but it's not due to population aging. It's due to the World Health Organization and our attempts to reduce the deaths of children in sub-Saharan Africa, in Indonesia and places like that. And older people are an unsupportable economic burden. Again, fundamentally untrue. It's very easy to devise economic systems in which we can easily provide for the needs of older people. And studies have demonstrated in the UK that the net economic impact of people over age 65 on the UK economy could be negative, they could be a drain on the economy, it could be positive, they're a positive contributor. Fairly good calculation shows the contribution to be a positive contribution of £65 billion annually. And from the University of Chicago, calculations of the worth to the US economy of the increase in life expectancy that occurred between 1970 and 2000 came up with a figure to the tune of a positive $73 trillion. So you may want to challenge me either in the discussion period or later as to sort of how those kind of numbers come about, because they fly in the face of popular perception of what is happening with increasing life expectancy. But it just tells us that we need to look more carefully at what is going on. So with apologies for overrunning my speaking time, but thank you very much for the invitation.
Wonderful, inspiring talk. So we have time for questions.
Thank you very much for the enlightening talk. I have two small questions.
Yep.
First question, let's bring you from October 23rd, 2005 to October 11, 2015. The most recent research conducted in University of Washington in the US says you can improve human longevity by 60%, 60%, because in our body, they have found, after the 10 years research, says that there are 238 unwanted genes. And by deleting these genes, you will then increase longevity by 60%. And they have conducted this experiment successfully. And this result is actually published by the British newspaper, The Telegraph. Well, as you also quoted another example, coincidentally, by Telegraph.
Yeah.
So now, how do you then delete genes? I'm not a biologist.
Yeah.
But so I was curious and I read further. It says in another parallel research, if you eat only 5 days a week, and that will mimic deleting 238 genes. It's not like I'm in the digital field, just say delete and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that will be easy, okay? Now, so this is, I'd like you to comment on this. It's about E-cell. So the second question is about mindset change versus reality.
Yeah.
I believe in neuroplasticity. I don't know about you. I happen coincidentally sit next to a neuroscientist. So I didn't ask her this question. So, and I strongly believe in this. Now, quote you an example. There are plenty of examples of those centurions. I don't know how to read this word.
Centenarians. Yeah.
So There is a recent example which I saw live on BBC only last year, third quarter of last year. There was this 92 years old woman, British.
Yeah.
She's a driving instructor. So the BBC journalist went on a trial run with her and deliberately made some driving errors. And she was so fast because it was a live recording and saying, hey, you make mistakes. And there was another woman from US that gave herself a bungee jump for her 100th birthday. And she said to her grandchildren, if she dies, this will be a perfect birthday gift. So I'd like you to comment on neuroplasticity
Right.
as well.
Okay,
Thank you. Sorry, the question is rather long.
That's all right. The last things that you mentioned, that you could have a 92-year-old lady who's mentally alert to be a driving instructor, I completely believe and accept. I completely believe and accept that you can have someone age 100 who can go bungee jumping and enjoy it and do it fine. The others, I just totally not supported by the mass of scientific data that we have accumulated now. The deleting, I forget how many genes.
238.
Yeah, 230. I mean, this is, we know what we do not know about the genes that influence human longevity. And I can absolutely assure you that nobody has any idea of any individual gene that by deleting it would have a positive impact on human lifespan. We actually, we really know that, and secondly, I mean, you don't know whether you could do it. Probably what people are doing is they're taking studies from experiments with things like nematode worms, where there are mutations that have an impact on lifespan, but they are very particular. And this is important because the nematode worm has evolved a life history in which if it finds itself in the wrong environment, it can switch off a certain number of genes. It stops reproducing. It becomes a highly stress-resistant dispersal form because what it is doing is it's saying, I'm in a bad place and I've got to get to a better place and this is not where I should make my babies, so I'm going to shut everything down related to fertility. I'm going to just hang in there and get somewhere else. Now, those genes we know in nematode worms you can mutate. We know that you can't mutate those genes in humans to achieve a comparable result. So that's one. The second one that you mentioned is about 5-day eating. And there is no evidence at all that reducing food intake will increase human life expectancy, other than because most people eat too much. And reducing food intake restores most of us who are overweight to a healthier state. If you're a mouse, slightly different. But again, like the nematode worm, mice are small animals and they evolve in an unpredictable environment. And I've done theoretical analysis of the mouse life history, which has shown that it makes sense when a mouse finds itself exposed to famine, that it switches off everything about its reproduction. And it makes a massive saving because mice spend a huge part of their energy budget on reproduction. So switch it all off and you immediately make a big saving. What do you do then? You're a short-lived animal. The famine may last 3 months. You don't want to deteriorate too much, so you save a massive amount and you can put a little bit extra into better maintenance and repair. But it will not work for humans, and where it has been tested experimentally in non-human primates, which are the nearest to the human condition, it has been shown that it does not increase lifespan. It will improve health, because if you feed monkeys as much as they want to eat, they get obese, just like humans do. they get metabolic syndrome, they get diabetes, they get sick. So, I mean, thank you for asking the question, because these are myths that, and you mentioned the Daily Telegraph and you mentioned the BBC, and these are myths that the journalists love to perpetuate. And it actually is rather important that we learn what science is telling us, and that doesn't get the same coverage. You've got someone like Aubrey de Grey. I'm sure some of you have heard of Aubrey de Grey. A man who has gone on record with the BBC as saying that the first human being who will live to be 1,000 years old is 60 already. Can we, maybe we could, yeah.
This is not said by me. This is neither said by the BBC. They are only proxy, okay? It was an interview with the people doing the research in Buck Institute. And one of the guys' name is called Brian Kennedy. So Brian maybe you should go challenge them. Thank you.
I know Brian Kennedy very well, and I know what Brian would say and would not say. And what has been reported is not what Brian Kennedy would actually say. It's a distortion of what he would say. It's, you know, this is just because, and this is serious, a serious issue, is that humanity has a very long history of fantasy about aging. So, I mean, Brian Kennedy is a responsible scientist. He's a good friend. I have a great respect for him. I know what his research does. I know what he publishes. I know what he says. And it is not the same as what sometimes gets reported in the media. But we can talk about this later.
Just a quick question to maybe link to the other speakers, and looking at the shrinking space between man-machine and the man-machine interface, and how that area of technology is going to impact on the aging process in the future rather than the biological, and any insights you have.
Quite a lot is made of the idea, which is perfectly reasonable, you know, sort of conceptually, that you could use engineering principles if we sufficiently understood the mechanisms responsible for the intrinsic aging, that we could use engineering computational principles to deliver a longer lifespan. The challenge is to discover enough to be able to do it, and then to do it. And in order to be able to calibrate that, I would simply say, you know, we heard a lot in the 1990s about genetic engineering. And there are single gene mutation disorders like cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, for which, you know, if you applied the same logic, it should be child's play to fix those, because it's one broken gene. And we know the gene that is broken, and we know what we need to do to fix it. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, on that principle, it could be done. The thing is with aging, we don't know yet enough about the mechanisms to be able to talk realistically. But, you know, there are groups, and these groups find quite a lot of favor, particularly in California, that talk about engineering negligible senescence. And you can take the kind of list of mechanisms that I have described to you that could contribute to the intrinsic processes of aging, and you can suggest that maybe if you could tweak this, or you could tweak that, or you could tweak the others, or do them all in combination, you might be able to achieve a result. But I think it's premature.
So the pacemaker for the heart is about as far as it's going to go?
No, I'm very optimistic about what will become possible. For example, targeting senescent cells within aging organs and systems may well deliver some therapeutic opportunities to specifically combat some of the more deleterious aspects of age-related diseases. But, you know, don't let's overpromise until we until we have done the basic science that establishes the route down which we might one day hope to proceed. There's a lot of exciting stuff coming out in the basic science of aging. Got to be careful about making the jump from short-lived model species like nematode worms and fruit flies to human beings, because our biology is intrinsically more complicated. But I'm an optimist, although you may get the impression that I'm very pessimistic about being able to use the science to enhance the human health span. I believe we will. We already can through nutrition and through physical activity and through one or two other things. And I think during this century we will see some quite exciting further developments. But I don't think we're yet at a point where futurologists who, people like Nick Bostrom, I've had a lot of fun debating these kind of issues. Of course it's good fun to speculate about what might happen there, but it's too profoundly important to allow our imaginations to run away with us and to avoid the real hard problems of making adjustments to a world in which people are living longer and longer.
I have two questions. The first question is in order to get away a little bit from this egocentrism and also look at other species.
Yeah.
So I would like to have a brief comment on these three possible types of aging behavior: the hydra, humans, and the tortoise.
Right.
So just to account for it. And the second question is the following. I remember that once Steve Stearns said that one way how he would be sure to increase average human lifespan would be actually not to allow people to reproduce before a certain age, and then slowly increase the threshold.
Yeah.
And that his prediction is then definitely would increase the average lifespan.
Yes.
So these two
Okay.
questions.
Now, these are really interesting questions. Hydra. Let me start with Hydra. I think everybody probably knows what Hydra is. It's a small animal about a centimeter long. You find it in still water. It's a little bit like a sea anemone. It's got a foot. It's got tentacles. Very interestingly, we heard in the lovely presentation about Leibniz, we heard about what was going on in the early 18th century, late 17th century. In the 18th century, Hydra were the hot topic in science because there was a furious argument raged about whether Hydra were animals or plants, because you could cut them into pieces and each piece would regenerate a whole individual. So just like plants where you take a cutting and you can grow a new one, you do the same with Hydra. So it was called the enigma of the polyp, and it was amazing, and some quite phenomenal experiments were done at the time. Now, then it was kind of parked for a while. And an Argentinian biologist called Daniel Martinez did a PhD in the 1990s in California. He was the first person to actually observe Hydra in the laboratory. And he kept a population and he watched the individuals to see whether they underwent an aging process. And at the end of 4 years, he wrote a PhD in which he reported that he saw no increase in age-specific death rate and no decrease in reproduction. And I often like to joke that he got his PhD on this basis, and a PhD spending 4 years watching nothing happen is a pretty small reward. So it was left, Daniel Martinez in the late 90s published this paper, but a paper was published in PNAS at the back end of last year that took those studies further and also reported in a bigger, more definitive study that Hydra do not exhibit any intrinsic process of aging. Now, why could that be, given what I've said to you earlier? Well, the answer is that Hydra have germline throughout the body. That's why you can cut the Hydra up into arbitrarily small pieces, and each piece will regenerate a whole individual. So in a sense, it's the exception that proves the rule, that tests the rule. Hydra do not age because Hydra have no soma to be disposable. differences between humans and giant tortoises, basically the longevity of a species is influenced partly by physiology and metabolism, but also by the level of environmental risk to which you're exposed. And a big tortoise has a relatively low level of environmental risk. It lives its life in a huge shell, so it's actually protected against many of the sources of accidental, intrinsic, extrinsic mortality. And according to the evolutionary theory of aging and longevity, you would predict that a tortoise should evolve to be long-lived, in exactly the same way that the theory predicts that birds should evolve to be long-lived, and indeed they are, although flightless birds go back to being short-lived. And bats are long-lived because flight, all these things, they reduce your level of environmental risk. So you can look at the spectrum of species lifespans, and they fit beautifully to the kind of evolutionary underlying model. Your point about could you select for increased longevity by preventing people from reproducing before a certain age? Well, this experiment has been done not in people but in fruit flies, and it's been done to great success, which is you can perform artificial selection in the laboratory. If you prevent the flies from reproducing until an old age, you're selecting for those individuals that retain fertility to greater ages. And a whole series of experiments have been reported that demonstrate that, yes, it works like that. You get flies that live longer, but they are less fertile. So what you're selecting on is the trade-off between fertility and longevity. Now, could it work for humans? Well, for humans, the complication is menopause. Now, menopause in women is a really interesting phenomenon because it's unique to human biology. There is some argument about whether certain whales exhibit menopause or not. And the evidence is completely inconclusive because you just can't study it to the same degree of rigor. But we know in every human population in the world, women exhibit menopause around the age of 50. And this is not seen in any other non-human primate. So if you take chimpanzees, our nearest relatives, they have a shorter lifespan, but the oldest age of a female chimpanzee giving birth is very close to the maximum recorded longevity for chimpanzees as a species. So they do not show menopause partway through the life cycle. Why should it be? Well, I've published papers on that, and it's I don't want to, in the interest of time, take too much on this, but there are very special features in the evolution of the human life history that explains why it makes sense that we evolved a menopause, and they mainly have to do with the size of the brain. Human evolution, human longevity was driven by evolving a bigger and bigger brain. And a bigger and bigger brain presents a real problem, especially when you've become bipedal. So, women started walking around on their back legs, sort of a long time ago. That places mechanical constraints on how the pelvis can adapt. So we're evolving a bigger and bigger brain, and the difficulty is that you've got to get that brain out through the pelvic girdle. And we know that in humans, the risk of maternal mortality because of the complications that arise from the big brain of the human neonate, is a real threat to survival. So what's happened? Well, sort of first thing happened is that we started having women give birth to babies with their brains only half grown. So that means that the babies are born much more dependent on the mothers than they would be otherwise. And because as a mother gets older, her risk of dying, pregnancy-associated complication becomes greater. Because the babies are dependent on the survival of the mother for longer, there comes a break point where it's better to stop having more babies in order to still survive, to raise your later born offspring. That's a very, very brief summary of a rather more complicated evolutionary scenario. So if you wanted to do the Steve Stearns experiment and select for longevity, what you'd have to do is to, assuming you could do it ethically, is you'd maybe have to pick, say, no woman could have a baby before age 45. And then you would selectively reproduce from those women who could give birth to babies between 45 and 50. And they would probably be the ones that retain their fertility longer. The upshot of that would be that you would probably select to postpone the age of menopause, and then you would be pushing on and on and on, and you could, in theory, evolve to be longer lived. And I would predict that if we could come back in, say, a couple of 100,000 years, we're almost performing this experiment already, because women are choosing to have their kids at later and later ages. And certainly it's a real problem in European communities, is that young women are now delaying their first childbirth to ages when their fertility is declining because of the approach of menopause. So if this continues, the women who will succeed in having kids will be the ones who are preserving their fertility for longer and maybe have a genetic predisposition to a later menopause. So, yeah, who knows where the future will go, but the menopause that we have at the moment is an evolutionary emergency measure to deal with the problem that has been generated in recent human evolution by the evolution of a progressively larger brain size. And because it was an emergency measure, the circumstances that drove that evolution, everything's changed now because we can have kids by cesarean section, and because kids are no longer as dependent as they would have been in hunter-gatherer communities on being raised by their mum. You know, the other people can step in, social services. So the two biological factors that drove the evolution of menopause no longer apply in advanced human society. Is that a satisfactory answer to your question?
Okay, we have time for
Thank you. I think in a few months I'll qualify to enter your Newcastle study.
Great.
But it's not about that. I won't move to Newcastle yet. I would like you to comment on what I have observed in Hong Kong. As you probably know, since last year, the Hong Kong women are the longest average living women in the world. Now, if you observe the Hong Kong Chinese population, aged population, not aging, aged population, their diet is Chinese. You see between 5:30 and 6:30 in the morning, all these, apparently 70% are practicing Tai Chi, rain or shine, and their physical activity is just remarkable. Most of them are poor or middle class. That means they don't have elevators in their towers, and they climb 17, 18, 20 floors several times a day, etc. So you have two, you mentioned that at the end, the physical activity and the nutrition. I think that there's a third factor. They are not medicalized. They have access to healthcare, but they are not considered to be chemical factories to absorb pills every day and to start breakfast with 2 blue, 1 red, and so on and so forth. I do think that in an urban environment which is exactly or very similar to Singapore or to Newcastle, the fact that we jump first on trying to fix every minor problem that people have may have more deleterious effects than benefits.
I would agree with you completely. I think obviously medicine can do a lot, and the people in the Newcastle study who have 4 or more age-related illnesses are benefiting from antihypertensive medicine. They may be benefiting from statins. They may, if they've developed diabetes, they may be benefiting from diabetes medication. But I think you're absolutely right that we, in Western medical context, we seek a medical solution for a condition where a lifestyle solution may well be better. And I think this is somewhere where Chinese medicine, I mean, there's traditional Chinese medicine that involves all the, the things that you eat and drink. Not so much that, but Chinese medicine puts a lot of emphasis on movement and on massage. And a lot of problems that older people experience are to do with reduced blood flow. So Tai Chi, walking up all those floors, going for a health-promoting massage that overcomes venous stasis, in the limbs of the body. All of this is really positive and healthy. And I think this is another part of changing the mindset, which is, if you have an old car, a vintage car, and you want to keep it going, you've got to do all the sensible things. You've got to change the oil. You've got to love it, and you've got to maintain it. And I think as we live longer, it's quite important that we individually accept responsibility for promoting the well-being of the body in which we live. So, to go back to the first question, I was a little bit harsh perhaps in dismissing the 5-day eating, because I know many people, my son included, who finds that a really good discipline. There are people who find it hard to reduce their food intake, across the board. But 2 days of pain is quite good. And actually, that's if you think what fat is for, we evolved fat as a way of storing energy because we never knew when the next meal was going to come from. So the fat deposits in our body are designed to be topped up and emptied out, and topped up and emptied out. What happens in today's world is that we top them up and we don't do much to empty them out. So this again goes with kind of lifestyle, and it does go back to the health-promoting benefits of eating more sensibly. Not, I believe, because it's going to slow the aging process, but because it will stop you developing pathology that will make you sick sooner than you need to be. So I think your question touches on a really important issue.
Okay, because of time, I think we can discuss afterwards in the adjourned session. So let's thank Professor Kirkwood again.